The drug war didn't spiral out of control, it quietly outgrew the people trying to stop it. While the public kept watching handcuffs, mugshots, and press conferences, the real transformation happened somewhere far less visible inside logistics routes, balance sheets, and silent agreements that never appear on camera. What most people still imagine as a violent underground is no longer driven by chaos or impulse, but by planning, delegation, and systems thinking. Mexican cartels didn't disappear when pressure increased. They adapted, shedding the old image of gangs fighting street corners and replacing it with something far more dangerous: coordination. Today, the drug trade doesn't need constant bloodshed to function. It needs timing, redundancy, and discretion. Violence still exists, but it's no longer the engine. It's a lever, pulled only when efficiency demands it. This is the uncomfortable truth few want to confront. The drug game didn't get louder, it got quieter, and silence is much harder to fight. Even more unsettling is where this story actually begins. Not in Mexico, not at the US border, but thousands of miles south in places most people never see, where the foundations of a global system are laid long before law enforcement ever notices the outcome. What you're about to hear isn't a story about criminals hiding from the law. It's a story about how power reorganizes itself when survival depends on intelligence rather than force, and why the most dangerous systems in the modern world are the ones that no longer look like crime at all. The system works because it doesn't rush and it doesn't improvise. Every global industry begins with raw materials, and for the modern drug trade, those materials grow quietly far from headlines in the vast rural zones of Colombia, Peru, and Bolivia. Here, coca is not chaos, it is agriculture. Fields are planted, harvested, and replanted with methodical precision, protected less by weapons than by distance, terrain, and routine. From these regions, the product does not explode outward in random directions. It flows guided along routes refined over years of trial and error. Hidden roads funnel shipments toward Ecuador and Venezuela, two pressure points where the system fragments by design. From there, cocaine lifts into the air aboard small aircraft, or slips into the ocean inside vessels that look indistinguishable from legitimate commerce. Central America becomes a relay, not a battlefield. Honduras, Nicaragua, Guatemala, El Salvador, each transfer, reducing risk each handoff, ensuring that no single group ever holds the entire picture. By the time the product reaches Mexico, it has already passed through multiple layers of insulation, accountability dissolved by distance and delegation. Mexico is not the origin, it is the optimization layer where routes are synchronized, losses absorbed, and schedules enforced. And waiting at the end of this pipeline is the most powerful force in the entire equation: American demand. The United States is not just a destination, it is the gravitational center that pulls the entire system northward, justifying every mile traveled and every risk taken. By 2018, this choreography generated an estimated $33 billion annually for Mexican cartels alone, a figure that has only grown as the system learned to move faster without becoming visible. What makes this pipeline terrifying isn't its brutality, but its reliability. It does not depend on fear or spectacle. It depends on continuity, and continuity is the hardest thing to disrupt. For decades, authorities believed the drug war followed a simple rule: remove the leader, and the organization collapses. It was a comforting idea, one that made arrests feel like progress, and headlines feel like victories. But that belief didn't collapse in a shootout or a courtroom. It eroded quietly, exposed by what happened next. When Joaquin Guzman Loera was captured, extradited, and sentenced, the operation was framed as definitive proof that the system still worked. Billions of dollars were spent, multiple governments coordinated, and the message was clear: the head had been cut off. Yet nothing stopped. Routes stayed open. Shipments continued. Money kept moving. Within months, it became obvious that the arrest had not dismantled the machine, it had merely removed a visible symbol. What authorities confronted instead was something far more unsettling: a structure designed to survive exactly this kind of pressure. Modern cartels no longer depend on a single leader issuing commands. They function through modular design, where selling, transporting, enforcing, and laundering are compartmentalized into semi-independent units. Each part understands its role, its limits, and its replacements. When one node disappears, the system reroutes automatically. In Mexico alone, more than 150 organized crime groups operate simultaneously, recruiting at a scale that rivals legitimate industries. According to multiple studies, organized crime has quietly become one of the country's largest employers, absorbing over 175,000 people into its networks. This isn't chaos, it's redundancy. And redundancy is how systems endure. The capture of a kingpin no longer sends shockwaves through the organization. It sends a signal to adapt. Leadership becomes replaceable. Visibility becomes a liability. What once looked like a hierarchy reveals itself as architecture. And architecture doesn't fall because a single pillar is removed. It shifts, redistributes weight, and continues to stand. This is the moment where the old narrative breaks completely, where the realization sets in that the war isn't being lost because of corruption or lack of effort, but because the enemy stopped behaving like an enemy at all. At some point, the cartels made a calculation that quietly changed everything. Drugs were no longer enough. Not because they weren't profitable, but because they were too visible, too exposed, too dependent on risk. The next phase wasn't about expansion through violence. It was about insulation through legitimacy. Across Mexico, criminal organizations began moving into industries that looked ordinary, lawful, even boring sectors that generated massive revenue without triggering alarms. Agriculture became one of the safest doors. Avocados, for example, weren't just produce, they were currency. Mexico controls roughly 60% of global avocado production, and in key western states, criminal groups seized farmland, displaced small growers, and cleared protected forests to control supply. When the fruit reached international markets, the money came back clean. No chemical traces, no contraband, no reason for banks to ask questions. Mining followed the same logic. Gold, silver, copper, iron, zinc resources pulled from the ground in operations that mirrored legal extraction, then quietly shipped overseas. Some mines were extorted, others operated entirely outside the law, exporting raw materials through ports where paperwork mattered more than origin. Even weapons trafficking, staggering as it was, became routine. Nearly 300,000 U.S. firearms moving south every year through corridors so normalized they blended into the background. But the most profitable shift came when cartels stopped moving goods and started moving people. Migration became infrastructure. Routes were standardized, fees, fixed enforcement absolute. What once involved desperate individuals navigating deserts became a controlled flow through cartel territory where crossing required payment whether you wanted protection or not. In December 2023 alone, hundreds of thousands reached the U.S. border, each having already paid thousands of dollars along the way. This wasn't smuggling, it was toll collection. By some estimates, human trafficking now generates close to $10 billion annually, rivaling drug profits without carrying the same legal exposure. Step by step, the cartels transformed themselves from traffickers into diversified shadow conglomerates, embedding their operations inside the legal economy while keeping their core invisible. At this stage, the threat was no longer the violence everyone feared, but the normalization no one noticed. Because once crime begins to look like business, it stops feeling urgent, and that's when it becomes permanent. Violence leaves bodies, but money leaves patterns. Or at least that's what investigators believed until the numbers stopped making sense. For an agency like Drug Enforcement Administration, following the money should have been the cleanest path to the truth. Global reach, advanced analytics, near unlimited resources, everything pointed to a simple outcome: trace. The profits dismantle the machine. Instead, agents ran into a paradox so persistent it began to feel intentional. How do you make roughly $70 million disappear every single day without triggering alarms? You don't move it in bulk. You break it into pieces so small they look like noise. The first blind spot appeared in plain sight: remittances. In 2023, Mexico received more than $67 billion in money transfers, the lifeline of families and workers spread across the United States. Most of it was legitimate. Some of it was mathematically impossible. States with relatively small Mexican populations were sending volumes that defied demographics, suggesting thousands of tiny transactions moving in parallel, each one clean on its own, devastating in aggregate. Then came cryptocurrency, not as a flashy heist, but as a discipline. Cash entered civilian bank accounts in modest amounts, always below reporting thresholds, converted into digital assets and dispersed across the blockchain. Once there, Ownership dissolved into anonymity, the trail thinning until it vanished. Investigators tightened regulations. The flow adjusted. The system learned faster than the rules. And then the trail led somewhere few expected to look: China. There, small and mid-sized companies quietly absorbed suitcases of cash as business revenue, depositing it into corporate accounts, where it blended with legitimate earnings. Funds were split, reshuffled, converted into pesos, and reintroduced into the global financial system as clean capital ready for use anywhere, including U.S. banks. No violence, no spectacle, just precision. This wasn't laundering in the traditional sense. It was financial engineering designed to operate 24 hours a day, 365 days a year without pauses or bottlenecks. Every time authorities exposed a method, another already existed, refined and waiting. For agents on the ground, the experience became suffocating, seeing money enter, seeing it exit, and watching the middle disappear like a mirage. The realization hit hard, and late the cartels weren't hiding from the system. They were exploiting it, mastering its rules better than the institutions built to protect it. And in that moment, the investigation reached its peak, not with a breakthrough, but with a silence heavy enough to feel like a wall closing in. Every investigation eventually reaches a moment where progress slows, then stops, not because the trail has gone cold, but because it has dissolved. For the agencies tasked with stopping this system, that moment feels less like failure and more like suffocation. Each time a laundering method is exposed, another has already taken its place, slightly altered, harder to see, better adapted. The system doesn't resist pressure, it absorbs it. Regulations tighten, reporting thresholds drop, international cooperation expands, and the machine adjusts without panic or delay. What investigators face is not a criminal network reacting in fear, but a structure designed to expect disruption. Following the money begins to feel like walking into a maze that rearranges itself with every step. Agents can see the entry points where cash floods in from drugs, extortion, mining, migration. They can see the exit points where clean capital reappears in real estate businesses and banks. But the center collapses into abstraction, scattered across thousands of microtransactions, jurisdictions, and intermediaries who look indistinguishable from ordinary civilians. The emotional toll is subtle but corrosive. Years of work lead not to arrests but to awareness without leverage. Files grow thicker, charts become more complex, and still, nothing breaks. This is where the narrative quietly shifts from pursuit to containment, from victory to damage control. The realization settles in slowly and painfully. The system isn't winning because it's stronger in force, but because it's stronger in design. It has no single leader to remove, no headquarters to raid, no moment of collapse to anticipate. Pressure doesn't weaken it. Pressure teaches it. And so the wall appears not a dramatic barrier, but an invisible one, where effort continues, resources are spent, and yet the outcome remains unchanged. This is the point where the fight stops feeling heroic and starts feeling structural, where the uncomfortable truth emerges that the rules governing the system favor those who can adapt endlessly, not those bound by procedure. And once that realization takes hold, the question is no longer how to win, but whether the game as it's currently played was ever winnable at all. What remains after the investigation ends is not resolution, but a lingering unease. Mexican cartels no longer resemble the enemies the public was taught to fear. They don't operate solely in shadows, nor do they rely on constant violence to sustain themselves. Instead, they exist in parallel with the legal world, embedded inside it, moving at the same speed, speaking the same financial language, obeying the same market logic. They are no longer just criminal organizations. They are systems, financial, logistical, and social. They generate capital, clean it invisibly, reinvest it patiently, and wait. The drug war as it was once imagined didn't fail because of weak enforcement or lack of effort. It failed because the opponent stopped playing the same game. While authorities continued to chase leaders, seize shipments, and count arrests, power quietly dispersed itself, becoming harder to see and even harder to touch. This evolution carries consequences far beyond narcotics. It reveals a deeper truth about modern systems: that scale, anonymity, and adaptability can neutralize even the most powerful institutions. The cartel model is not sustained by fear alone, but by participation by thousands of ordinary people, businesses, and transactions that appear harmless in isolation. That is its greatest shield. And that is why this story doesn't end with justice or collapse. It ends with a mirror held up to the world that allowed such a structure to thrive. The question left behind is unsettling and deliberately unanswered. If a criminal system can learn, adapt, and integrate this efficiently, what other invisible systems are already shaping our lives without our consent? The rules have changed quietly and permanently. And whether society recognizes it or not, the legacy of this transformation will outlast any cartel, any arrest, and any war declared against an enemy that no longer needs to hide. The real danger isn't just the drugs, the money, or the violence. It's the illusion that these systems exist somewhere far away, disconnected from everyday life. This story is a reminder that modern power doesn't always announce itself with force. Sometimes it hides in efficiency, convenience, and silence. When systems reward scale over accountability, they don't just enable crime, they normalize it. Understanding that is the first step toward changing it. If this investigation challenged the way you see the world, take a moment to support this work. Like the video, share it with someone who needs to see it, and subscribe for more deep dive stories about the hidden systems shaping our lives.